Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session organized by the Straits Times. I've just asked my fellow panelists to join me on stage, and this session is called, Can the Mainstream Media Respond to the Social Media Challenge? My name is Warren Fernandez, and I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Straits Times here in Singapore. So having a discussion with several journalists on the panel, you can assume the answer to that question is going to be a resounding yes, short answer. But if you're interested, we are here to have a debate and discussion on the issue, and I'm sure we will try to make it worth your while. With German efficiency, I've been asked to be host, moderator, and presenter all rolled into one, so I shall try to do my best. But I have help from my friends here. Let me just introduce them briefly. First of all, Professor Joseph Liao, the Dean and Professor of Comparative and International Politics at the Rajaratnam School here in Singapore. Next to him, Dr. Wan Saiful Wan Zhan, Chief Executive of the Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs and visiting fellow at Singapore's International Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Next to him, my old friend Sutichai Yoon, co-founder of the Nation and Nation Media Group and a member of the ANN, which we belong to as well. So thank you, Sutichai, for joining us. And last but not least, my comrade-in-arms, Ravi Velo, Associate Editor of the Straits Times. Now, I just want to sort of get things going with a very brief and simple presentation. And essentially, I want to take up this discussion of the mainstream media and social media. And instead of doing it in an abstract sort of way, I'd like to do it in the context of the 2015 general election in Singapore. And not for any inherent reason, but because I think it's probably better to discuss the issue in a real and sort of concrete way. So after my presentation, I'll ask each of my fellow panelists to share perspectives from outside Singapore. So we will be able to talk about the Malaysian election, perhaps the Indonesian election, as well as the Thai elections, and then Ravi, of course, can span all across Asia and the globe. It's called putting pressure on your colleagues. But let me start with the Singapore election, taking up the social media challenge. And essentially, if you think back to the 2011 general election, where the ruling party in Singapore lost several seats and a big group constituency seat as well, that caused shockwaves all around the country. And many people in social media and elsewhere began to draw straight line projections into the future, where this was going to be the way it was going to be in the future, with more and more seats being lost to the opposition, the social media getting more and more of a dominance in terms of political communication, and ultimately the demise of the mainstream media. And 2015, as a result, was widely seen as the election which will be the social media election. Of course, having taken over as editor of the Straits Times in 2012, it was not going to happen if I could possibly help it. So when I started on trying to figure out how to respond to this new media landscape, the first thing we thought we had to do in the Straits Times was to undergo a sort of comprehensive and fundamental change in the way we reported the news. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but Ravi will bear me out to say that we undertook a major transformation of the newsroom in the Straits Times to transform it from a pure print operation to a completely multimedia operation, which was able to do everything that we saw being done in the social media space. So if people were interested in blogging, we would blog. If people were interested in Facebook, we would be on Facebook. If it was Snapchat or Instagram or any one of these proliferation of platforms, we would be in that space. You see here a picture of one of my colleagues in the newsroom doing a television-style forum, which we began to do several years ago and have grown better and better at doing over time. And essentially, it was to be able to operate in that space, online, with videos, with mobile, to ramp up our political coverage so that we would be available to readers anywhere, anytime, any way they wanted it. And the challenge for us was to make sure we maintained our dominance in readers' minds and to be that go-to place for political information. And of course, we had a lot of competition emerging, from the likes of Mothership and TOC and Yahoo News. And my challenge to the political desk in the Straits Times and the rest of the newsroom generally was that come GE 2015, we should continue to be the main source of information for the audience in Singapore. And I'm happy to say that during the campaign, September 1st to 11th, we saw our website traffic nearly double. And we saw the traffic on the day of the election and the day afterwards triple. So that was a good outcome for us because it said to me that people were still coming to us and relying on us for information rather than the audience being split up across many, many sites. But don't take it from me because I'm obviously a biased party. This is from a presentation that was done earlier in this afternoon, a study by the Institute of Policy Studies in Singapore, Dr. Carol Soon, no friend of the Straits Times, often critical of us, but this is their conclusion, and I'll just read you. Against prevailing assumptions, GE 2015 was not a social media election, and an online survey of 2,000 people concluded that the mainstream media and their online counterparts were used most frequently and trusted more as sources of information. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome, a better quote. Straits Times didn't sponsor the survey, I hasten to add. So I was very happy with this outcome because it said to me that what we were trying to do, we did to some extent manage to achieve. Now, the second point I'd like to make, which we can get into discussion as well, is the way in which social media not only influences and competes with mainstream media, but serves as an echo chamber where views start to get reinforced and hardened and strengthened in the process of being repeated. And this was something we saw in 2015 as well, because people in social media were drawing straight lines into the future. Everybody, and I mean everybody, began to believe that it was inevitable that there would be a further loss of seats for the ruling party, and perhaps going further than anybody had anticipated. And this was the view if you had spoken to people in the PAP camp, if you had spoken to people in the Workers' Party camp. Many people took this as a given. And during the campaign, I remember speaking to several individuals, people I met at rallies, friends of mine, people, complete strangers, and they were saying to me, there is a certain disconnect between what I'm hearing in private conversations and what I'm seeing online. Because online, there's a certainty that we're going to see a lot of seats changing hands and more GRCs or group constituencies will change hands at the election. But in private conversations, people were saying, well, it is the Jubilee year of independence. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has just died. The Prime Minister is popular. Surely that would translate into votes for the ruling party. But online, there was that echo chamber going on and reinforcing views. And I think that's a phenomenon which is not unique to Singapore. If you look at what was going on in the American elections, you look at what was going on in Brexit, a certain view took hold as the prevailing conventional wisdom, and it became very, very hard to challenge without any independent basis to do so. And that, to me, is a second important conclusion I draw from the challenge from social media. And it's to do with the importance of news organizations having the resources and the commitment to invest in their own ground operations so that you get a very good understanding of what's going on in the real world. You see the picture there, that's a celebratory mood in the Workers' Party rally, all of them kind of assuming that victory was on the cards, but when the results came true, didn't quite turn out that way. And unless news organizations have that ability to do good sensing of what's going on the ground, there is a very real danger that we allow social media to sort of shape the way we shape our coverage, and that can give rise to surprising outcomes. The third point I'd make is a simple one, again related to the importance of credibility. Obviously, as I mentioned, the importance of having your own ground operations so you can have a credible view of what's going on in the real world. obviously the importance of media trying to be fair, impartial, independent in terms of shaping our coverage. And I can tell you in 2015, we took great pains, right down to the choice of pictures, the choice of headlines, to maintain a line of being seen to be credible, because we felt it was so important in the face of so much competition out there that we be seen to be fair, because otherwise there was no way we would hold on to our audience. And I think the outcome is in the survey bore that out. If you don't believe me, go online and Google coverage of 2015 general election, and you'll see a lot of commentary on it, for the most part, making the point I've just made. Now, the importance of being credible is not only something you do during election time. I'm of the view that it's something you've got to do throughout the process, constantly. And that relates to the importance of journalists going out and engaging newsmakers as well as their readers day to day and constantly, and making the effort to show your readers and your audience that really you are one of them, you are on their side, and minded to report the news accordingly. That's why in the ST Newsroom, we have launched a whole series of reader engagement activities, including what we now call the Ask ST platform, where we go out and talk to our readers about issues and topics that are of interest to them. And I think the failure to do that in media spaces elsewhere is precisely what has enabled a gap to open up between media commentators, media practitioners, newsmakers, and their audience, allowing the likes of your Breitbarts and your alt-right to emerge and paint them as fake news and alternative media as the so-called real news. I think therein lies the great danger that mainstream media face. If we don't make the effort to show our readers that really we are with you and we are one of you, then you allow that space to be opened up. And to me, the whole challenge of maintaining the credibility of the media is not only for journalists to do, although a large part of it falls on us. There's also a responsibility in society from newsmakers, from business leaders, from community leaders. I can tell you every politician out there is a believer in the freedom of speech until it impinges on his own ministry. And it's important because when you get a president of the United States who is routinely pouring scorn on the mainstream media and calling it fake news, it undermines the credibility of the media. It undermines the credibility of the institutions. And I'd like to contrast that with the approach taken here, which I found quite helpful, where the law minister has gone out of his way to take on and expose some alternative sites which were actively promoting fake news and stirring up xenophobic sentiments for profit. And in doing so, I think he has done all of us a service, but helped the mainstream media because it has, in a way, reinforced in people's minds the critical importance of having a reliable source of information. And I think that has helped because the recognition that there are sites which are actively trying to diminish and destroy and undermine the credibility of mainstream media for their own profit. And mind you, it is a commercial imperative that's driving it. The more they can diminish the Straits Times or other mainstream sites, the more they can draw profit from it. So by having newsmakers, business leaders, deciding that they're not going to stand for it, it does reinforce the ability of mainstream media to hold our ground. So I'd like to just conclude with three big thoughts that I'd like you to think about, and maybe we can discuss it further in the Q&A. Firstly, I believe very strongly that for democracies to survive and to work, it's absolutely critical that you have a good source of reliable media. Media that's minded to be fair, impartial, objective, and strives to do so. Obviously, we'll make mistakes, we'll never always get it right, but when we do, we recognize it, we correct it, and we move on. For the media to be able to do that, it needs resources because fact-checking, ground operations, going into a subject in depth is a costly exercise, and professional journalists have families and kids to send to school, and they are just as keen as anybody else on bonuses and promotions and all of that. So it is a costly exercise. And that leads me to the third big question in my mind. How is it we are going to get in our societies media structures and media organizations which are sound and sustainable for the long haul? Because unless we get that right, the second doesn't follow, and then the first doesn't follow. So without the financial resources to be able to deliver good media, we're not going to get good democracies as well. So I'll wrap it up there. Happy to take any questions that you might have. I'm going to move quickly to my colleague, Professor James Liao, to talk, just to share with us. I've asked each of them to give us a few opening thoughts on the subject of elections, political coverage in their countries, and then we can get into a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not a journalist, so my views certainly don't derive from any sort of professional engagement in the context of the industry. But nevertheless, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share some thoughts on the topic. I've been given 5 minutes, so I will make 3 points in the typical Singapore fashion. The first is, as Warren had pointed out already, the media terrain really has changed. I remember in the field of strategic studies, Karl von Clausewitz, the German strategist, when he described what is unique about the state. His conclusion is the state is unique in the monopoly that it has on the use of force, the legitimate use of force. Today, mainstream media, if I may put it this way, mainstream media no longer has the monopoly on information, or certainly not even as the main source of information, as Warren had pointed out. Really, anyone with a smartphone and a Wi-Fi connection and an idea, automatically interjects himself or herself into the information terrain, becomes a purveyor of information. And we have seen this more and more with the advancement of technology, and this is the reality of the information terrain that we face today, compounded by the fact, I think, in my view, that given the mood for instant gratification today in society today, it poses a challenge. Why? Because if you want to verify the authenticity of information, it's not easy to do that overnight. It takes time, it takes effort, and people don't want to wait that long before they sort of come to a conclusion or form an opinion. So that is a real challenge. The second point, if we look at the US, of course, we all know about the visceral attacks that President Donald Trump has launched against the mainstream media. I mean, with his entire campaign came this resurgence of the phenomenon of fake news. Of course, fake news is not something particularly new, but certainly it captured the headlines, if I may put it that way, during the American election, where the president very conveniently conflated fake news with flawed news, right? And didn't bother to draw a distinction there, and did a great disservice, I think, to those who really were endeavoring to try to get the authentic and verifiable information out. But on the other hand, you also have a situation where the mainstream media, perhaps being on the defensive, being on the back foot, has, they've directed their energy and vitriol at the president. And that, I would submit to you, is not helpful either. They've gone to great lengths trying to discredit whether it's the president or members of his cabinet, or more likely members of his inner circle, but nevertheless being overtaken by the frustrations and making themselves susceptible to less than rigorous assessment of whatever information and data that they are given. That is a big risk as well. And I think if I were a journalist, even as I would try to sort of defend the sanctity of my profession, I would be cautious about being drawn into this information battle with people who are really intent on using or playing up these sorts of very negative type of circumstances. But the third thing, a third point I would make before passing the mic on is foreign policy, which is something that I follow. And what we have come to notice is the increasingly important role that social media has been playing in shaping popular opinion, which has an impact on foreign policies of states. You saw that in the case of, not too long ago, of all things, Chinese social media, and their discussions of anything from terrexes to Oxley rice, and in that context, taking pot shots at Singapore. You are seeing that today, as recently as this afternoon, with the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. I think that that problem is one that is proving intractable already. But over and above that, I think it is becoming the center of some major, if we could put it this way, information warfare, in the sense that it has been difficult for journalists to get in there to get information out. Okay, and as a result of that, it's gone to the point where information is even being fabricated. I think we saw recently, I think it was the Turkish Deputy Prime Minister tweeting pictures of the Rohingya crisis, which were later proven to have not been, had nothing to do with Myanmar. There were pictures from floods in Bangladesh to other sort of incidences. But nevertheless, the stoking, the using of media to stoke sentiments, and given not just the rise of or the influence of populism, but just in general the accountability that political leaders increasingly have vis-a-vis their electorate. They have to take these things into consideration, and they very often find themselves under pressure to act. So on the one hand, they're under pressure to act on these on information, false or otherwise. On the other hand, they could very well generate such information as well in order to influence or to trigger a process that would lead to a conclusion which they would desire. Which is quite unfortunate, but nevertheless, it's again nothing new. We saw this during the Cold War. The Soviets were doing, the Americans were doing, the Chinese were doing, the British were doing it. We still see it being done today. So on that note, I will stop.
Thank you, James. Actually, thank you, Joseph. I'm interested in the point you made about Trump conflating fake news with flawed news. I'd say he conflated fake news with any news that was not in his favor, really. Yes. But we can take that up during discussion. Let's go to one Saiful.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Right. If you were here in this room in the previous session, some of the points I'm going to say now might be a repetition of the previous one, but I'll try to make some different points as well. Now, when listening to your presentation just now, the thing that struck me the most is the issue of credibility. And you mentioned just now that people come to mainstream media mainly, because it's seen as more credible. But the challenge is, how do you ensure that you have enough resources to maintain that credibility? Now, in the context of Malaysia, I think it's slightly different. People go to social media because they do not believe that mainstream media has that credibility. Now, it's a reverse of the situation in which, but probably resulting from the heavy regulation that the government has and the heavy control that the Malaysian government has on mainstream media in the country. And as a result of that, people are saying, okay, that is being published by this newspaper, that must be propaganda. Today, unfortunately, newspapers that used to be respected, like Utusan Malaysia, TV channels that used to be highly watched, like TV3, today it's become a national embarrassment to actually go out there and tell people that you watch or read, those two platforms. And this is a shame because people are losing trust in that credibility. They see the mainstream media as mere propaganda tools, and therefore they social media. It'll be very challenging for media platforms in countries like Malaysia to adapt to this changing environment. I think the line has been crossed a little bit too far to the extent that for mainstream media to regain that credibility is really difficult. Most people, especially those in urban areas, would still rely on certain newspapers like The Edge, for that credibility. And if they have access, they are able to read English, they would read newspapers like ST online. But this is not the case when you talk about the majority of the population. And this is a worrying situation. Because when you talk about social media, it's not just about Facebook, Twitter, and all this. It's also about what's being circulated on WhatsApp, applications like WhatsApp. And I think social media today, if you talk about the online news portal, there are some really good ones, but they have taken side. So if you want to read about the opposition news in Malaysia, you go to online news platforms. You want to read about government news, you read the printed newspapers. So when you have a dichotomy like that, online news portals are usually pro-opposition, and the printed newspapers are mainly pro-government or anti-opposition. Then the battleground is set between the two, not just about the battle between political parties. And I think this is really worrying. People then resort to reading what's being circulated in as I said just now, WhatsApp groups and so on. And this is really a big problem because there's no way to verify the credibility, the reliability of things that are being circulated through platforms like that. In the previous session, I mentioned an example where I received an article. It's a well-written article. And at the bottom, it's signed by someone who's quite prominent in the country. And I thought, wow, okay, I didn't realize that this person actually writes this lengthy essay. And I was even more surprised that he wrote, what was said to be his writing. So I checked with him, and it turned out that he himself had never seen it before. It's not from him, but it is signed as him. And this is an example how things can go really wrong. It does influence how people vote in elections, since we're talking about the influence on elections. It does have an impact on how people think. Now, in the context of a country like Malaysia, the problem is slightly more complex as well because we have language barrier. The majority of the population do not really speak English. They can read English a little bit, but they don't converse, they don't read it on a daily basis. So maybe they will understand a few words here and there, but not as a conversational tool. And that results in conversations like what we're having now being restricted to the English-speaking audience, which is not the majority of the population. Now, if you go to Malaysia, you will find that we have Malay newspapers, we have English newspapers, we have Chinese newspapers, we have Tamil newspapers. You go to Sabah and Sarawak, we'll even have Borneo-specific newspapers. that, that means the type of audience that you need to write to is very different from one another. I write in an English newspaper as well as in a Chinese newspaper. And what I'm finding is the editors ask me to write on two very different things. The Chinese newspapers want to know what the Malay population is thinking about. Whereas the English newspapers, they want to make sure that I write things that they can publish. And what you end up with is you have authors who do have certain ideas, but they know that there are certain things that you should not write about. So self-censorship becomes the norm. It's no longer about fighting the editor on getting your article to be published. It's about fighting yourself and making sure you write what you really want to write about. Then the editors will come in. You bring that kind of conversation to the wider context. I think there is a challenge when the media industry is heavily regulated, and I don't know very much about the type of regulation that we have here in Singapore. Even though I've been here 6 months, I should have learned more, I know. But if you look at the debate that's happening in Singapore, for example, there are certain issues that really do touch on fundamental rights of people, but they're not discussed very well. I give you some silly example, like the recent debacle surrounding that imam who read the prayer in the mosque, saying that, oh God, please help us Muslims against the non-Muslims. Then it was made viral online, on Facebook and so on. And then it resulted in one university lecturer being suspended from his role and the imam being deported. Now, there was no debate at all about fundamental rights, about freedom of speech. There's no real debate about how freedom of speech can actually impact on social cohesion. These are debates that we should have, but we don't have them. You go to a country like Malaysia, it will be worse because it's not just there's no debate. There will be a debate. It will be about how much harsher the punishment should be on that imam, and how the Muslim really need even more help from God to defeat the non-Muslims. So the debate is really different, very contextualized, and this is a result of too heavy government regulation on the media, I think. But unfortunately, I don't know where that balance is. It's a very difficult topic for me to comment on. Where do you draw the line? Because without regulation, things can become really bad in terms of ethnic relations in a multicultural society that is ours, Malaysia and Singapore. But with the heavy regulation, you get a situation in Singapore where things are not debated properly, and things in Malaysia where if you have a debate, it's not the kind of debate that you'll be proud to comment on. So where do you draw the line? I don't know, but if we don't find the right balance, it'll be really difficult for this mainstream media to challenge the rise of social media. That is actually more worrying to me because social media is not tied to particular ethics or rules and regulations. I would prefer to have mainstream media dominating the sphere. But I'm afraid the trajectory now is if mainstream media do not adapt or even adopt social media platforms, they will be the one losing out. The battle seems to be gradually being lost towards the less regulated social media platforms. So I'm divided. I'm divided between this need to regulate and not regulate. I prefer not regulating, but I know what the challenges are. I also worry that regulation will create less credibility to the mainstream media. Thank you.
Thank you, Wan Saiful. It's really interesting that every time there is a Malaysian election, our traffic on the ST website just shoots through the roof. And I think that says something about where people are seeking out information from. The point about the lack of debate on the imam and freedom of discussion, maybe during the Q&A I can call on my colleague Zakir, who's sitting somewhere at the back, because I do remember he did write a piece on that whole saga, reflecting on the issues that arose. So I wouldn't say there was no discussion on it. So I challenge that a little bit. But you make a fair point, the importance of credibility, and if the mainstream media doesn't sort of get into those discussions, then we become increasingly irrelevant. So that's something we certainly bear in mind. Next to my old friend Sutichai, can tell us about social media and the mainstream media in Thailand.
Well, I make no distinction between mainstream media and social media because over 10 years ago, when a young student showed me Twitter and showed me what it could do, that very moment was the moment of enlightenment for me. I thought my life was going to change forever. I went back to the office, to the newsroom, and I got reporters, photographers to a meeting. I said, hey, things are going to change because if they can send a message from one mobile phone to another instantly, then our job could mean two things. We're going to die soon, or we're going to prosper really, really in a big way. Because I foresaw then that as a reporter, if I could really transmit my message to anyone, at that time, one-on-one, one-to-one, it's not even one to many yet. To me, that was really the breakthrough. And then, of course, we immediately changed our way of thinking and way of doing things by slowly changing how the newsroom operated. Our reporters, photographers, editors started to write blogs. Of course, there were a lot of complaints in the newsroom and a lot of resistance. The main question is, do we get more pay if we write a blog? Are we going to get a pay raise? We are already very busy. Why do you ask us to do all this additional thing? Which nobody cares anyway except you. So I told them, I said, I cannot promise a pay raise. In fact, looking 4 or 5 years from now, it's not even a question of whether you're going to get a pay raise or not. It's a question of whether you're going to get paid or not. That was quite controversial at the time for an editor to say that. But I thought I would go really, controversial and wake them up. In fact, every day when I see photographers in the office and joking with them, I said, you remember 5 years ago, I came back to the office with this thing called a digital camera. That was when, a friend from Taiwan came back with the first digital camera. They said, hey, we don't need film anymore to take pictures. So I went back and I talked to all the photographers and said, hey, great, this is going to be great. We do not have to have film anymore taking pictures. And all of them, shouted at me and said, Kun Sutichai, this is just a toy. This is just a kid's toy. Don't get too excited about it. And of course, I gave up because I knew that the first digital camera wasn't that good. But a year or so after that, the digital camera became much better. So I went back to my photographers and I said, hey, this is getting better. Half of the room still said I was stupid, or naive, But now, when I joke with them, I said, remember what I said to you? They all forgot, of course, what I told them. So we embraced social media in a serious way. So when the topic came and said, how do traditional media cope with social media? It's not a question. Traditional media have to become social media, one way or another. And traditional media have the advantages, as Warren pointed out, that the non-traditional media who only use social media would not be able to compete with us if we know how to use it. So all the critical factors that Warren mentioned are the main core values that traditional media will have to uphold and sustain to be able to survive. The question raised in Malaysia about social media exposing the irrelevance of the main media, newspapers, TV, was in fact not a surprise, because when social media began to become really obvious to society, it was clear that this is a new tool that would open up the communications channels to all people. So if you try to control the information flow, then you would fail. Whether you are government, whether you are a CEO of a company, whether you are a leader of a community. And that was the flip side. The good side was that it will be free to everyone. When the budget airline started, I think a little bit before social media, the slogan Air Asia was, now everyone can fly. And in fact, in the beginning, we were laughing. Come on, this is just a PR gimmick. But then a few years later, we said, everyone can be a reporter. And then a lot of people said, come on, it's not possible. A reporter has to have some kind of qualifications. A reporter has to have some educational background, has to have some good training. As it turned out, it's not necessary that a social media reporter needs any training or any standard at all, as we find today, and that's why we are now debating the issue. But in Malaysia and in many other countries, the government-controlled media are, of course, exposed, and then the credibility is not there. But in certain countries, Thailand may be an exception. We were relatively free, the media, for a long time. So when social media came along, the mainstream media, newspapers, TV, embraced social media, of course, in different ways at different levels, strengthened, empowered the existing traditional media in a big way. And then because Thai society later became very divisive, we had the red shirts, we had the yellow shirts, they were all using social media to their own benefit. So you have stories that I wouldn't say fake news, I would say they are partisan news, news that only promote one view from their side. And cable TVs, local radio stations, not necessarily only social media, all the medias that they could get hold of started to spew out propaganda from their side. That, to us, the professional traditional media, was a great boon, because then people turned to us and asked the question of, is this true? Tell us whether this is true. We heard that this person was doing that to that person. So they came to our newspapers, TV stations, and of course websites and social media to get verification. In that sense, if you have a reasonable ecosystem of freedom of expression, social media is a great benefit, and it's a great empowering factor for the whole society. Of course, at the same time, the flip side is that if you have a media, a population which has been tightly under control, social media will expose that and will, of course, make major changes. The transformation will happen for both sides, for both the empowering side and also for exposing the elements that were trying to control the people's or channels of expression. So I think for each country it's different. For Malaysia, I think this time social media websites have more credibility than the traditional media. But in Thailand now, because of, unfortunately, the last decade of very serious conflicts within the political circles, independent professional media have been able to gain more credibility. The only question for the traditional media is how to really embrace social media to the point that they could survive financially, as Warren pointed out. There's no question that if you do not adapt as traditional media to social media, then the chances of survival are very limited. So now the challenge for Thailand's media, traditional media, would be to really fully embrace social media, but at the same time, find a business model that could really sustain that new model. That is still work in progress. They're still uncertain, but that is obviously the only way to go for a lot of media people like me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudichai. Sudichai is one of the founding fathers of the Asian News Network, but he's also a trailblazer because earlier this year he challenged all the ANN partners to join him in a Facebook Live presentation and did the very first Facebook Live for ANN. So
yeah, let me add about Facebook Live. It started only 6 months ago. Facebook started to offer this live service only about 6, 7 months ago, and I jumped into it because, I am addicted to social media. But I need to show the leadership in the newsroom, because if I don't try it, the rest of the newsroom will say, it's not that exciting. But one very positive aspect of social media, or YouTube Live, or Facebook Live for that matter, is that for the first time, you can get very good, solid opinions, analysis, real analysis, meaning people who really know what they're talking about, to the ordinary people. This kind of opinions you don't get on TV because it's too long, because it's not, the ratings are not good. These kind of opinions are not in newspapers because some of these experts don't write. Some of these people, you have to get them while they're on Facebook and say, come and talk about what you were writing about. And they say, okay, but don't ask me to write an article because I don't know how to write. I've never written an article, but I'm willing to talk about what I just wrote, or or the pictures that I just sent out. So for the first time, the democratization of social media, of opinions, of knowledge is available to people. And also a very interesting trend that when you do TV and newspaper, you tend to think that people over 40 read you or watch you. But when you're on live, Facebook Live, you get a cross-section of people. I meet people, secondary students, who met me in a restaurant, walked up to me and say, I watch you on Facebook Live. I said, you? How old are you? 16, sir. And why are you watching me? Oh, it was very interesting. You were talking about North Korea. You were talking about Trump. Can you imagine a secondary student, Thai student, getting interested in Trump and North Korea? I said, why? He said, oh, you tell a story in a very interesting way. It's so exciting. And for the first time, I have the attention because it's on my mobile phone. I don't have to fight with my parents for the TV screen. So now, and this, I think researchers should start working on this, that the social media are attracting people of various age groups that not necessarily are confined to a certain demographic definition as before. So you have baby boomers and the teenagers watching the same program on Facebook Live. And I think that is very encouraging.
thank you. Ravi, next.
Thank you, Warren. I must begin by congratulating Kun Sutichai for having such a young mind at the age of 71. And for those of you who missed the morning session, it was revealed he has 2.3 million followers on Twitter. That's more than many prime ministers have in this world. So, I think you are a lesson to us in keeping an open mind and learning new things, and constantly, innovating and relearning the game. And I think as long as we do that, we will all be in business as you are today. Let me begin with a little story. About a month ago, 6 weeks ago, I went to see the CEO of BBC Global. I was hoping he'd offer me a job. He didn't.
I had a word with him before.
But he told me a very interesting story. So he is traveling to New York City, and everybody knows that the immigration people, they called Homeland Security and Border Security and Homeland Security in the US, they are not the most friendly of people. And there was a long line, and he finally reached the top of the line. And there was this very dour character, looked at him, said, "Where are you from?" I said, "From the UK. What are you doing here?" "I'm here on work." "And who do you work for?" He says, his name is Jim Megan. He said, "I work for the BBC." He says, "Oh, you're the guys who don't make up the news." You know, and today what we're seeing is the two trends. I mean, since I want to speak a bit to the subject of elections, elections are a time when all boats rise. Even the most partisan papers see an increase in circulation and readership. And we saw that, as Warren just said, during the 2013 Malaysian elections. We were amazed to see the eyeballs coming from Malaysia and the interest that the Malaysians showed in the Straits Times coverage of their election. And that was partly because we had feet on the ground and we were hopefully going down the middle in our coverage. You know, we didn't take any sides. And as Wan Saiful said, you know, I mean, it's very partisan coverage in the Malaysian media. So you're looking for people outside. So there are big opportunities there. And at the same time, there's also a flight to quality that you can see all over the world. So I think on the whole, if you look at the situation, things are not so dire for so-called mainstream media. But the challenge is to hold on to this audience after these big blips in readership and viewership take place. And how do you do that? I think the first thing you have to do is begin by asking yourself, as newspapermen, as journalists, are you covering all the angles? And this is what happened even with the BBC. I mean, they got Brexit all wrong. New York Times just completely misread the 2016 election. And why does this happen? Because there are too many people, I mean, so-called people like us sitting in the newsroom. We don't have our ear to the ground. If we did that, we'd have done a much better job in covering the angles and wouldn't have lost the credibility that you know, some of us took on that score. Secondly, I think we need to learn, as Sutichai has done, to constantly move with your audience. Years ago, 35 years ago, we were colleagues in Asia Week, and we had an editor-in-chief called Mike O'Neill. And Mike was, you know, he didn't even go to college. He entered the trade at the age of 16 or 17, you know, walked into a newspaper in New Zealand and asked for a job. And it was amazing. Those days, color photography was very expensive. And if you remember Asia Week and Far Eastern Economic Review, it was all black and white coverage. First, Mike began to use color on the cover. Then 4 pages out of 72 used to be in color. And why was he moving slowly towards color? Because of the onset of television. You know, because television and color television, you know, things were changing. And finally he went all color, and it's a major decision to take because it's a mighty expensive exercise to go all color. But he did that, and it paid off. And by the end of that decade, Asia Week had crossed Far Eastern Economic Review in circulation. So you have to move with the times, and you have to ask yourself, are you talking in the language that your audience or your consumers understand? Saiful spoke about it a while ago in the previous session when he said, I wish I could learn to make an argument in 140 characters. I mean, it's brilliant that coming from an academic who doesn't really have to think in these terms, I mean, he's telling us what we as journalists should have learned by ourselves a long time ago. And I think it's one of the big lessons that we need to take to learn to write for this audience, that have short attention spans, have multiple, a variety of news vendors that are offering them stuff. So my essential message is the battle is not lost. In fact, it's still a winnable war. But how do you counter it? Now, one element that the mainstream media suffers from is attacks from social media that tilted news and all that. But if you look at the anti-hacking game, for instance, I mean, there are lessons to be learned there. How did the hackers these days go about it? In the old days, there used to be a McAfee or a semantic sitting on your computer, and when you opened your computer, it booted for about 15 minutes. Today, there's a small patch that lies on the computer. It's an algorithm connected to the cloud. Why is that so? Because every moment, the cloud is changing. The malware is just increasing. I mean, the day you put in something that just sits on your computer, it's out of date 10 seconds later. So these guys, they talk to the cloud, bring it down, and they're constantly battling the bad guys. And I think we also, in journalism and mainstream media, have to learn to do that and to counter it. And finally, I just say it's important to go back to first principles. And what are those first principles of journalism? The first is accuracy. The second is balance and fairness. And the third is flair. And I think if we get it all right, I think we'll still be in business 50 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. So it seems to me there's certain commonalities in what everybody is saying. Importance of credibility, of keeping up with the communications technology, and most of all, engaging with your audience. So on that note, I'd like to start by doing that and see if you've got questions about what we've been talking about, so that we're not just talking as media practitioners or media watchers, but to get a sense of what you are interested in. So can I see a show of hands if anybody has a question? Yes, please, Deepika. Get a mic to you. Just tell us who you are and where you're from. I know, but the rest of the room doesn't.
Hi, my name's Deepika. I'm the Press and Information Officer for the European Union and spent 9 years as the arts correspondent at the Straits Times. I want to thank all the panelists for a very insightful presentation today. And my question really was, and this was a discussion I was having in the morning, it is that the story will survive. I mean, one of the papers I read from page 1 right till the end is the New York Times. I'm always amazed at how they survive because there's so little advertising. But just the power of the stories that they narrate makes you hang on to every word, move on to the next comma and the full stop. And really, we are living in this social media sphere where, Joseph, you make the point that nobody has a monopoly on the information that is available, let alone the mainstream. And I think one of the projects I really benefited from as a reporter was the Straits Times Passion Project that really allowed you to pick an idea and gave you the resources and the funding to go and work on a long feature-length journalism report. So really, I mean, it's a question to all of you in this age of 140 characters, how do we make that story survive? Because I mean, Ravi, I remain very optimistic, as you do, that journalism will stay, but it has to reinvent. And do you think we have to sort of relook long form in an age of 140 characters?
Perhaps I could just start and take a stab at that. I think what we're seeing in all the trends online is that good journalism survives, whatever the platform it may be. And by good journalism, I think we're seeing it at both ends of the spectrum, because the audience is asking for information, short, sharp, interpreted quickly for them, and in a very efficient sort of way. But at the other end of the spectrum, there is a great hunger for long-form journalism. So, in-depth pieces which have got good visuals and interactive graphics. Those are the kinds of content that people also want. So it's not the case that you have to do everything in 140 characters. That may be useful for a short, sharp news break or comment, but the other end of the spectrum is also seeing a great resurgence as well. So that's very positive for us. The big challenge in my mind is how to fund it. So I don't see social media as a challenge to us journalistically. The big challenge is the commercial imperative. That's my big worry.
My advice would be to do both. To do both the 140 character tweets and also to do long form journalism. As Warren said, and I can confirm that, long form journalism, even if you put it on your Facebook page, gets read, especially if it's really good and if really unique. If you write something that other people don't write about, or you write about something other people write about but with a different angle, deeper, and looking at it from another angle, it gets read. My own experience in doing Facebook Live is people say people's attention is very short. So if you go on live, you have to really shout and scream and dance and sing. I said, no. I would try to engage my guests in the conversation. And I would try to make it very informal, not like a TV format. Believe it or not, sometimes my chat on Facebook Live lasts 1 hour. And the number of concurrent, we call it concurrent viewers, goes up and not down. So it's the topic, and it's the way you engage your guests, and at the same time you engage your live commentators. Because with Facebook Live you get live comments. And if you engage with them too, they will stay and they will share. The great benefit of going live on social media is there is this share button, which is a great boon for us, people with content. They share your content instantly. And also another big benefit is that clip is saved forever. People can go back and watch that clip and share again. So if you get, say, about 500 concurrent viewers, and people watch you later on, it goes up to maybe a few thousand. 5 days later, it could go up to 6,000, 10,000, 20,000. So it is how you tell the story. It is how you shape your content. It's how you do your homework and really get the stories across. And the stories have to have good quality, in-depth reporting, analysis, with people who usually do not talk in public with any other media outlets. So I don't give up on long-form journalism. In fact, I think if we do it as Ravi said, back to basics. You check both sides of the story, you verify the facts, and then you make sure that you present the story in a balanced way and an interesting way. So I think the opportunities provided by social media are incredible. If you know how to use social media properly, we will get more people reading, listening, watching our content much more than what we have been getting in the past 50 years. But if we give up, if we sort of follow the myth that it has to be short, it has to be dramatic, it has to be spectacular, it has to draw attention, it doesn't matter whether the content is good or not, but just make it crazy so it goes viral. I don't think that is a sustainable formula. I think we really need to sit down and work out the content and make sure that we understand what the public wants. So don't go for clickbaits only. Make sure that you engage in an audience that has quality, that sticks with you every time you go live, every time you put something on social media, they will follow you, and that, I think, will be even more sustainable. And in fact, in the commercial sense, you get people who want to be part of your story too. It takes time, of course. It takes patience, and it takes a lot of professional work.
I think Wan Saiful wants to jump in, yeah.
Just a very quick one. You see, I'm not from the media industry, but I write in newspapers. I think we need to distinguish between the survival of long-form journalism as an industry with the ability to influence public opinion in elections. Now, these are two different things, I think. The long-form journalism as an industry, as a sector, will survive. I mean, people still read books, and there's a much longer form of journalism in different kind. So that kind of writing will continue to have an audience, but how influential would they be in elections, in shaping voting decisions? I think that's a slightly different topic from the survival of the industry.
Actually, not necessarily so, because I remember during the height of the American presidential campaign, we in the ST newsroom were kind of grappling with trying to understand the psyche of the Trump supporters. Why is it they were so viscerally in support of this candidate? And we asked our US correspondent to go out and do a series of long-form pieces and interviews and videos to explain to our readers the strong support that he had. And those stories were very, very well read. And the videos, so it was long-form journalism related to a political issue, which it didn't have a direct impact on the elections because nobody here could vote. But I suspect if the American media had done similarly long-form pieces explaining to their readers where this well of emotion that he was tapping into, it might have had an impact on the elections. So I do feel that long-form journalism can survive. The big problem is it's horribly expensive to put boots on the ground and develop video, and it needs newsrooms to be committed to putting that kind of resources to doing it. So Deepika mentioned that we in ST have what we call passion projects. Nothing to do with anything amorous or anything of the sort. It's basically what is it the journalist is passionate about doing. And if you can convince me and my colleagues that it's worth time and energies to do, we will move heaven and earth to get you the resources to do it. Obviously, resources are constrained and we can't do an endless amount of those, so we have to pick and choose our subjects very carefully. But let's take another question from the audience because I see the clock clicking away. Any other questions related to the subject? My predecessor as editor-in-chief of the Straits Times, he's got a zinger of a question coming for us, I'm sure.
Wow, that's I got pressure without being on the stage. Thank you, Warren. I learned a lot, inspired by what was said on stage. But a point kept cropping up. How do we fund this in a sustainable way? And you cut down on the passion assignments. I can understand why.
We haven't cut down. I just said we have a limit to how many we can do.
Yeah, I mean, reduce the number. Yeah, okay, I've been subbed, it's okay. I agree. So, but that's the key, right? Whatever our aspirations, whatever our hopes, is the funding. And it's not newsroom, it's the organization. So if we can't get the revenue, can newspapers, media organizations, think of some other way to get co-funding? I don't mean crowdfunding, but co-funding of worthwhile content for mainstream media, which I think should include social media, because we've got to be on both, on all the platforms. Thank you.
I'll have a stab at it and then please jump in. I mean, Peter, you're entirely right. How to fund good journalism is the big challenge of our times for us in the media industry. I won't deny that it's a huge problem because the underlying business model for media has been completely disrupted. We used to be able to pay for good journalism through advertising, but print advertising is on its way down. For ST, it's still pretty robust, but we can see the trends happening elsewhere and we know it's coming at us. Digital advertising is growing for us, but it's a fraction of what we command in the print space. So many news organizations are now trying to look for alternative sources of funding, and digital subscriptions is one way to do it, to get audiences to recognize the value of content and be willing to pay for it. If you ask me, I think many media organizations, led by media organizations in the US, made a strategic mistake by deciding to give away content for free. And that became a habit, and it was established in people's minds that this content is not worth paying for, and therefore you get the result that we get. News organizations having to cut their bureaus, having to cut their staffing and manning, and the result is weaker journalism. Many news organizations are grappling with ways to deal with it. If you go to the Guardian website, you will see sort of plaintive messages saying, since you're here, will you please give us a donation? It sounds rather sad. And mind you, the Guardian has a big foundation to promote good journalism behind them. So they too are struggling with this issue. For us in Singapore, we have a media group which is expanding into other fields, property, healthcare, to try to sort of get new revenues. But that is only part of the answer. And our challenge going forward is to find new ways to fund good journalism. The trust model is one of them. Co-funding is another. And ultimately, I think we will have to make the case to our audience that this is not a cost-free endeavor. And we will have to persuade people to put money behind it. I mean, and I don't mean just readers. I also mean business leaders and community leaders. Because if you are a business leader and a CEO, you have the power of the purse. You have the power to decide, do I put my advertising in Facebook and Google, and I have no clue where my ads appear? It could appear next to a terrorism site or a porn site. Or do I go to a mainstream media, an organization that I can trust, but also which I would like to support so that it continues to be able to deliver the kind of journalism that I think is important. We'll have to do all of that. I don't have a magic formula, but believe me, that is what I'm focused on day and night, Peter.
Yeah, two examples on two extremes. One is public service journalism. One proposal from America is that the 3 or 4 major social media companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, put up an endowment of $1 billion each to fund good quality journalism. That would be totally non-commercial. In the end, that proposal might have to be considered if society believes the role of professional journalism is still vital. If professional journalists still can prove that they are relevant. The other extreme, and that involves us in the current business model, will have to go through digital advertising revenue. There is a trend, I think also in Singapore, but in Thailand, that more and more advertising money goes to digital advertising agencies that are not part of the major advertising agencies anymore. They are young startups. They may be 10 or 12 employees serving companies that want to advertise only in social media. The budget may not be big, but the trend in the past 2 years, the amount of digital advertising budget in Thailand has shifted from TV, newspaper, to digital advertising in a dramatic, significant way. That means that news organizations must transform their marketing salespeople to be able to grab that portion of digital advertising budget to fund the current business model. And many news organizations, at least in Thailand, have not realized the importance of transforming their marketing and salespeople yet. So they still go to advertising agencies, They still sell their ads by column inches, by the old model is still there. But I see that trend, and we are trying to move to that trend. And in fact, you have to hire totally new people, young people who have no experience in the previous print tradition at all. They have to think digital. And that is the most difficult part. How do we train? How do you get the old advertising managers to train digital salespeople? They belong to two totally different world. Just like how do you get an old veteran newspaper editor to train a new digital reporter? That's exactly what is happening. So I think the transformation, the rate of adaptation in news organizations is still too slow, too reluctant, too afraid to get out of the comfort zone. So we have ourselves to blame. And I see that examples everywhere, including my office, that we are not moving fast enough. They know what they have to do. 5 years ago, they might still shake their heads and say, why do we have to change? Why do we have to adapt? But now they know they have to change. But then they ask you, the boss, the leaders, we know we need to change, but how do we need to change? Tell us. The leaders say, I don't know myself exactly how you have to change, but you have to change, and you watch. Just ask yourself, what you produce today, is it sellable? Does anyone want what you produce today in terms of news stories, content, or even advertising? But these questions are not being asked enough. And that's why, we see the slow, in some places, very rapid decline of both revenue, morale, and the future is here, is crumbling. The old model is definitely crumbling, and we're not changing quick enough to adapt to that.
I wonder if our two friends from academia have any insights on funding the media or alternative ways of funding that you think might be. I mean, Sutichai talks about public service journalism. That's quite a well-established approach with television and radio, but not so much in the print and online sort of space. Would that be something that you think would be acceptable to the audience as users of the media? How would you react to such an approach?
For me, first I would say that I'm racking my own brains trying to raise money for my school. so that
we're all in the same boat. Yes.
That in itself is tough. Okay, I think that from my impression is that at the end of the day, the commercial viability depends, at least in part, on things as mundane as circulation and hits, right? And that really circles back to something that we were talking about at the very beginning, the extent to which mainstream media is viewed as credible, is viewed as objective. And I think there is this growing questioning of that, fairly or otherwise. There's this growing questioning of that today. I mean, a panel like this, I don't know, but I think 10, 20 years ago may not have been an issue, but it is an issue today. We see that happening in the US, we see that happening in Europe, in Malaysia, I totally agree. I think even in Singapore, I have a lot of friends who, are of the view that the Straits Times basically just echoes what the government is telling them to echo. So they read it only for
your
sports.
friends?
my friends. So they just read it for sports, they tell me, right? But there is this perception, like I said, rightly or otherwise, and it needs to be addressed, because I think that gets to the core of the issue. I mean, there's a flip side. You can go the sensationalist path, okay? But that, I think, as was mentioned earlier, is untenable in the long run. And certainly, you cannot have a business model built on that. So it gets down to this issue of the credibility, objectivity of the news. I think the market is there. the market is there because precisely because we live in such a complex and complicated age that people want to have a sense of direction. The difficulty is in certain instances there are other imperatives involved in presenting the news, and this is something that we never discuss. I mean, in a perfect world, in a purist world, you can be objective. You can allow the journalist to do the research, draw the informed conclusions and present it. But we all know we don't live in a perfect world. There are economic imperatives, there are political pressures. That's the reality of it all. So the question is how leaders can provide the direction and protect the journalists from becoming demoralized, from becoming disillusioned. Are leaders prepared to, in a sense, take the hit, for their team? And I think that is something that we need to put on the table as well.
Is there a last question? Yes, please, the gentleman right in front. Could I get a mic to him?
Coming back to the issue of funding, and you, sir, are a social media influencer, Mr. Stuchichai, with 2.4 million followers on Twitter. How much would you charge for a retweet?
I have been asked by advertising agencies, but I have not taken that up so far.
But you have been asked.
I have not taken up any advertising in my Twitter account.
So theoretically, how much would you?
1 baht each.
1 baht. No wonder the media is in trouble.
No, sorry. No. Just joking. I have not even thought about that. I want to use that for the overall branding of the Nation Group. Not only because my credibility is also very important. I don't want to be said among the advertising people that, hey, you can buy Sutichai.
I think that's very important because once you lose that reputation,
Yeah.
you've lost everything. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm very careful with that. So I'm using that as a more or less an image-making thing for the whole group. So we move forward together: newspaper, TV, websites, social media.
Please.
Can I just add? I can give you an example of how people do pay. In Malaysia, for example, there's a website, there's a news portal, Malaysia Kini, that charge, they do charge people in order to read the news. So, and people do pay. So it can work, but I don't know whether we have that environment for that model to work everywhere. But it does work in certain examples.
Yeah, I have been thinking about setting up another Twitter account and making it very clear that it is for PR only. Yes, to be very transparent about it. And that maybe, it's Nation PR Twitter account. And we charge, and then we let people who follow this account know that these are PR stuff, PR stories, and they would have to accept it. But I think you can really make it interesting too. You don't have to make it down, and you can rewrite the press releases, the stories that are sent by product managers, but you have to be transparent and you have to keep that credibility.
I think that's key. We've come to the end of our time. I just want to conclude with one last thought, if my colleagues will permit me. I'm actually not pessimistic about the future of the media. If I look at the numbers in terms of our print readership, yes, it is on a secular decline. But if you look at the way in which our digital readership is growing, never before, and Peter will forgive me for saying this, but never before have more people come to us for information. And they come to us not just once a day in the morning when, Peter, you were running the newsroom, you had one point to reach your audience. Today, I reach the audience in the morning, on their phones, on their laptops, on their desktops, when they get home on their tablets. So I have multiple points of contact with them. I reach them on the radio. I reach them at events like this. They come to my runs. They come to my coffee festivals. So it says to me that we do have an audience, and people are interested in the news, and they will pay for good quality content. The challenge for all of us is to convince them that we do have the good quality content rather than to go elsewhere. I don't make light of that challenge, it's a huge one, but I'm by no means pessimistic about the future of the Straits Times. Some news organizations will fall by the wayside. I don't think journalism in itself will go the way of the dinosaur. The critical question is which news organizations are going to survive, and I think it's the ones with people like Sutichai at 71 leading the way into the future, personally with his own personal example. If we can get more journalists to be like him, I think we have a very bright future ahead of us. So please don't leave the room on a dour and pessimistic road, because I don't think it's the end of the road for us. Peter, please. Yeah.
This feedback. Recently I had lunch with I shouldn't say who because I don't have permission to quote him or her, someone very, in the intellectual industry, if there's such a thing. And he told me something that's made me very happy, even though you're the boss now. Well, I shouldn't have said that way, but you're the boss now. He said, Peter, my wife and I, we really enjoy the long reads in the Straits Times. We also subscribe to New York Times and some other. And I know that the Straits Times, he said you, I said no more me, but you reproduce stuff from New York Times. But the Straits Times own journalists and the long form journalism, my wife and I really enjoy and love them.
Thank you, Peter, and please send my thanks to this friend of yours. So thank you, everybody. Please join me in thanking my panelists, and thank you.